In Bong Joon-ho's 2019 film Parasite, its narrative is constructed through media codes and conventions to reflect the economic context of its production. Set in late 2010s South Korea, a society shaped by rapid industrialization and widening social and economic inequality, the film explores the failure of social mobility, structural class inequality, and extreme economic disparity. Through the manipulation of cinematic techniques, the narrative positions audiences to recognize that the gap between the rich and poor in South Korea is extreme and is nearly impossible to close. Bong Joon-ho's authorial intent is central to the film's construction, as he uses Parasite as a vehicle to reflect and critique economic inequality in South Korea in the late 2010s. The economy of South Korea is largely defined as state capitalist, where the state undertakes business and commercial economic activity, and where the means of production are nationalized as state-owned enterprises. This economic model emerged in the aftermath of the Korean War as the South Korean government pursued aggressive state-led industrialization policies to rebuild and develop the nation. The Miracle on the Han River refers to the period of rapid economic growth from the 1960s to the 1990s that resulted from this model, which turned South Korea from an underdeveloped nation into an economic model for other developing countries. However, the 1997 Asian financial crisis exposed structural weaknesses, leading to an IMF bailout worth over $50 billion. 11 out of the 30 largest South Korean companies collapsing, as well as major economic restructuring. As a result, wealth became increasingly concentrated, particularly through the dominance of the chaebols, who were responsible for a majority of the country's GDP. In fact, around 5 companies, which are Samsung, Hyundai, LG, SK, and Lot, account for nearly 50% of South Korea's total GDP. Consequently, many citizens experienced income reductions, and unemployment tripled to nearly 7%. This crisis caused widespread business failures, triggered a nationwide gold collecting campaign, and caused a surge in suicides. This created a society characterized by extreme economic disparity, class inequality, and traditional values, which formed the foundation for the narrative constructed in Parasite. Rather than simply reflecting reality, Bong Joon-ho actively constructs meaning through visual contrasts, spatial hierarchy, and symbolic motifs to emphasize the barriers between social classes. He employs codes such as camera and sound to visually illustrate the class division between the Kim and Park family. The camera is often pointed down at the Kims to emphasize their position in society. Lights are often dark and dull in the Kim household, while they're typically very bright in the Park household. These codes work together to establish visual conventions by consistently pairing vertical framing with contrasting light levels to create a recurring visual language throughout the film, reinforcing class hierarchy. By using codes and conventions, Bong Joon-ho ensures that the context is not separate from the narrative but embedded within its construction. However, it is important to acknowledge that Bong Joon-ho's construction of class inequality is not perceived in the same way across all audiences. While Bong himself has stated that Parasite is not a film with a simple message or moral, his intentional use of cinematic codes inevitably produces different readings depending on the cultural and economic background of the viewer. A South Korean audience, shaped by lived experience of chaebol dominance, the lingering trauma of the 1997 financial crisis, and the social stigma attached to semi-basement living, is likely to engage with the film's critique on a deeply personal level, recognizing the specificity of its cultural references and reading it as a direct reflection of their own society's structural failures. In contrast, a Western audience may engage with the film's themes more broadly, interpreting it as a universal commentary on capitalism and class division, rather than a culturally specific critique of South Korea. While this broader reading allows Parasite to resonate globally, it risks diluting Bong Joon-ho's intentional commentary, stripping away the historical and economic context that makes the film's critique so specific. In this sense, the film's meaning is not fixed, but is instead shaped by the cultural lens through which it views. In this sense, the film's meaning is not fixed, but is instead shaped by the cultural lens through which it is viewed, suggesting that Bong Joon-ho's authorial intent, while deliberate, is ultimately influenced by the audience's own social and economic context. This is most clearly demonstrated in the under-the-table scene, in which Ki-taek, Ki-woo, and Ki-jeong are forced to hide beneath the Park family's coffee table as the Park family return home unexpectedly from their camping trip. This scene operates as a miniature version of the film's broader class critique, constructing inequality as invisible yet constantly reinforced through the deliberate manipulation of media codes. Bong Joon-ho's use of camera angles throughout the scene is particularly significant in reinforcing the power dynamic between the two families. Low-angle shots are employed when framing Mr. and Mrs. Park, positioning them as dominant and authoritative figures, while the Kims are shot from above, physically compressed beneath the coffee table in a visual representation of their social immobility. This framing is not accidental, as it mirrors the vertical symbolism established throughout the film, where ascending and descending spatial positions consistently correspond to ascending and descending social status. The Kims are not just hiding, they're literally beneath the Parks. Lighting further reinforces this constructed hierarchy. The Park family is bathed in warm, soft light as they settle onto the sofa, a visual comfort that reflects their insulation from hardship. In contrast, the Kims are submerged in shadow beneath the table, visually removed from the social world above them. This contrast in lighting code works in combination with the framing to construct a visual language in which the class difference is rendered in terms of visibility and invisibility, in which the wealthy are illuminated and seen while the poor are hidden and suppressed. Sound design and mise-en-scene deepen the scene's construction. The Parks talk casually and intimately, their dialogue drifting into commentary about the smell they notice in the room, a smell the audience understands to belong to the Kims. The Kims remain completely silent, their lack of noise being a direct representation of their lack of power within this social space. This silence is reinforced through mise-en-scene as the Kims are physically compressed into empty space beneath the table, surrounded by the clutter of household objects that render them almost indistinguishable from the furniture around them. They are, in every visual sense, part of the background. Above them, the Parks occupy the full open space of the living room with ease, sprawled across the sofa, surrounded by the carefully curated furniture of their home. The contrast in how each family occupies space within the same frame is itself a construction of class difference, with the Parks' expansive, unobstructed environment reflecting their social freedom, while the Kims' cramped, shadowed position beneath them reflects their confinement. This construction positions the audience to understand that class oppression in South Korea is not always obvious, but is instead embedded in the everyday social unconscious of the wealthy. The smell itself functions as the scene's most loaded symbolic motif, directly tied to the economic context of the film. Mr. Park notes that he sometimes notices the same smell on the subway, which is commonly associated with the working class, linking the Kims' scent to shared living conditions, cramped housing, and limited economic mobility. In late 2010 South Korea, where the cost of housing in Seoul had risen sharply and lower-income households were increasingly confined to semi-basement dwellings, this detail is not just symbolic, but also based on reality. The smell then becomes a metaphor for the conditions of poverty that the wealthy can afford to notice only briefly and dismiss, while the poor must live in permanently. This scene constructs class inequality not as dramatic or exceptional, but as mundane, socially accepted, and structurally invisible to those at the top, which Bong Joon-ho suggests is precisely what it makes so difficult to overthrow. This idea is further reinforced in the opening scene, where the audience is introduced to the Kim family and their terrible living conditions. The mise-en-scene of the semi-basement establishes the social class the Kim family are currently at, as shown through the low roof, the proximity to street level, and how Kitaik tells the family not to shut the window when the street is getting fumigated, as it will kill the stink bugs. Similarly, the family folding the pizza boxes demonstrate how the family will practically do anything for money, even something as simple as folding pizza boxes. This repetitive action demonstrates how the Kim family will subject themselves to the most simple and mundane tasks just to barely make a living wage. Even in a task as simple as folding pizza boxes, they're still failing the task, which mirrors how the Kim family keep failing to make it out of poverty, despite their best efforts. There's such a stretch. I guess. Additionally, interactions between the girl who collects the pizza boxes and the Kim family demonstrate how even those of slightly differing socio-economic statuses, working class versus poverty, treat each other. Through mise-en-scene, the film constructs social class as something physically inescapable, as the Kim family are not just poor, but are trapped within a living space that visually mirrors their position in society, with the semi-basement's low ceilings and street-level proximity serving as a constant reminder of their place at the bottom of South Korea's rigid class hierarchy. Ultimately, Parasite demonstrates how its narrative is shaped by the economic and historical context of its production. Through its use of media codes and conventions, the film exposes South Korea's structural class inequality, failure of social mobility, and extreme economic disparity between the upper and lower class. The economic context is not just a background theme, but a driving force behind the narrative of the film, as the recurring theme of social class is impossible to ignore, especially in the under-the-table scene, in which social class is brutally exposed to its harsh core. The film fundamentally argues that in South Korea's late 2010s economic landscape, shaped by decades of rapid industrialization, financial crisis, and chaebol dominance, the gap between the rich and poor is not merely wide, but structurally permanent, and that no amount of planning, effort, or deception can bridge it.